Well, hi again, everybody, and welcome to another episode of 100 Yards of Football. Today, we are visited with Fran LeBel. He's to my right. Vincent Turner, unable to make it today. He's got a scheduling difficulties, so he wasn't able to be here today. Jeremiah Long is our producer and engineer. Thank you, Jeremiah, for putting all these pictures together. So we welcome Fran LeBel. Brian, thank you for being able to be on the show for one. And we're going to talk a little bit about Francis Tarkenton, and we're going to have a little bit of a discussion about one of the greatest players and certainly a leader and a category leader in so many different ways for the Minnesota Vikings.
Yeah, thank you for having me. When talking about, there's a lot to get into, so there's plenty for us to talk about.
Yeah, not much in terms of, the numbers from his early days, and we're talking about high school and college compared to the way that things are today. It was a lot more run, punt, or run, score. But he was certainly a leader in a number of different ways and kind of a trendsetter, if you will. We'll talk about that in just a little bit. So Francis Asbury Tarkenton was born on February 3rd, 1940. He's 85 years old right now. His nickname was a scrambler. His nickname was a guy that, he was a dual threat. But I think he was one of those guys that did things a little bit differently. And I'm not giving him the nickname, but he was certainly a trailblazer in many different ways because his ability to run. He was born in Richmond, Virginia, back in 1940. And about the time he was 10 or 11, they moved to Athens, Georgia. The family did. And that's where he went to high school, what is now Clark Central High School, but Athens High School back in those days. Fran was a great athlete. He's about 6 feet. At his peak, he's about 190 pounds. So let's say he's between 150, 160 his freshman year of high school. By the time he was a senior, maybe 175 or 180. But at high school level, he was a quarterback, and he played defensive back. He was a great basketball player. He was a fantastic baseball player. And amongst the three, it was noted that he was one of those guys that would probably be a better baseball player than the others. His coach in high school said he had a fastball that nobody could hit. So every time he was on the mound, we had a chance to win. But Francis Tarkenton, in his high school, he was known for his leadership and his willingness to go the extra mile for his teammates. And there were a lot of friends during the recruiting process that said that he should probably end up going to Tech. Georgia Tech was a better team at that time than Georgia, and they were recruiting him heavily. His senior year, he was all-state in football, basketball, and baseball. His junior year, they were state champions, so he had a chance there to be recruited and seen for a full year after a great junior season in high school. He went to one of his advisors and a coach at Athens High School to ask him what he should do. Wasn't quite sure. Tech, as I mentioned, a better team, a better program at that time, but there were guys ahead of him in line, and he may not have had the same chance to get on the field early on. If you remember, folks, players as freshmen back in those days couldn't play at all. They were ineligible. So that was a part of the decision too, is looking down the line and seeing what the depth chart and how that looked. There were two guys at Georgia that were ahead of him. Obviously, they had plenty of quarterbacks that were at the school, but deep down, he thought that he had a better chance to get on the field earlier if he went to UGA. And so he ended up deciding to go to Georgia. In his freshman year while he was there, had a great season for what would be considered the JV team, or really it's a freshman team, but you couldn't play on the varsity that time. They beat Clemson, they beat Auburn, they beat Georgia Tech while he was there. And it wasn't until 1958 that Charlie Britt, who was the starter at UGA, ended up being the competition for Fran. Their first game that sophomore year for Fran Tarkenton, they go to Texas, and they're playing in Austin, and they're losing. And sometime in the third quarter, there was a timeout, and Charlie Britt, the quarterback, was a little bit slow to get on the field. And Fran grabbed his helmet during the timeout, and just before the officials blew the whistle, and he races out onto the field, and he's not supposed to play. His head coach doesn't know that he's doing it. Wally Buck said, "What are you doing out there?" But he ends up starting at the 5-yard line. They go 21 plays, 95 yards. They score a touchdown. The extra point team is ready to come on. He waves the kicker off the field. They go for two, and they get it. They end up losing 16-8 to Texas, but that was the only score that they had. He got benched for the rest of the season. He was still there. He got to play maybe a little bit, but they didn't want him on the field. So that's welcome to college football. But Fran said that during that Texas game, that was the most influential part of his life, a moment that changed him forever, to show the guts to go out there, to actually do it. And even though he faced some kickback from that in many different ways and had to sit for another year and a half before he ended up being the starter, that was something that he, in his own mind's eye, said, I know I did the right thing. I didn't do it the way the coach wanted me to, but I certainly made myself a better player for doing that. So that, Brian, is my introduction to Fran and what type of individual he is and how he would help change football forever because of his mentality.
Yeah, I mean, he certainly was one of the faces of the game for a very long time. Um, obviously you said it started there at UGA. Obviously the stats in college aren't really going to jump out at you because, back then it was 3 yards in a cloud of dust. And one of the things that Fran helped do, though, is he kind of helped revolutionize that. He kind of helped change that. He was at the forefront of the landscape of going in and saying, hey, maybe we operate a little differently. I know because of that, he butted heads with coaches, not just in college, but in the pros as well.
Sure did.
But he was definitely a trailblazer with what he was able to do. And to walk out there, like you said, to just say, hey, listen, QB1's a little slow. I think I can give us a little bit of juice. Let me see what I can do. To have the confidence to go out and do something like that and just, kind of shrug it off like it's no big deal it takes a certain kind of person to do that. And Fran certainly had the it factor when you go talking about that as far as an athlete, as far as a guy. He kind of culminated that in his time.
Yeah, he definitely, because he could run and throw. As a pitcher in baseball, he had a strong arm. They didn't throw nearly as much back in those days. So when he wanted to throw, back then, really the coaching staffs of almost every team in the country would say, whenever you throw a ball, 3 things can happen, and 2 of them are bad. I tend to disagree with that. Whenever you run the ball, 3 things can happen, and 2 of them could be bad. You could get hit behind the line of scrimmage or tackled at the line of scrimmage. You could fumble. And in the passing world, it's either an incompletion or an interception. He certainly had a few interceptions in the day, but he was very daring in how he wanted to move the ball down the field, and he exemplified that many different ways. In 1959, led Georgia to a 9-1 record. They were SEC champs. He played in about 90% of the offensive snaps. He played a little bit on defense as well. He was a cornerback, but they were undefeated in SEC play. They go to the Orange Bowl, and they beat Missouri, who was the number 18 team in the country back in those days. Missouri was very good. There weren't a whole lot of bowl games, so when you win the championship, that was a big deal back then. They end up winning 14-0 against Missouri, and so now he's got this championship in his belt buckle. And the sky's the limit for this young man. He was first team All-SEC. He passed for 736 yards. You mentioned the numbers. They're not really a lot right there. He had 6 touchdowns and 6 interceptions. So, yes, run, punt was part of the strategy back in those days. Field position was certainly a different aspect of it, but he certainly established himself as being one of the better college players. And in 1960, they were 6-4, Georgia was. He was an all-SEC quarterback again, threw for 1,189 yards during that season, had 7 touchdowns and 12 interceptions. But then comes the NFL draft, Brian, and obviously there's a different world that the players back in those days lived in. In 1960, there were 2 leagues. There was the AFL, and there was a National Football League, obviously. And the draft usually took place right after the season was over. It was in early December. And he had a choice to make because he had 2 teams that were interested in him. The upstart expansion Minnesota Vikings, when you see the picture in the upper right-hand corner, well, all the way onto the right, you can just tell by the uniform and the crew cut that was very early on in his career. He ended up signing with the Vikings, even though the Boston Patriots drafted him. He was a 5th-round pick for the Patriots, a 3rd-rounder. And again, there were only 12 teams in the league at that time in the National Football League. So there were more choices, but certainly not a lot. But I believe he made the right choice in playing for the Vikings, and that's where he started his career.
Yeah, I think when he got to the professional level, I think his nickname, the Scrambler, I think he definitely lived up to that. I think what he was able to do, he played 18 professional years as well. I mean, he was, I don't know if necessarily I would put it in that manner of speaking, but the Tom Brady of his time, as far as the longevity, as far as how long he was able to do what he was able to do. The numbers that he had were actually really impressive given everything else. I mean, he had over 47,000 passing yards, 342 passing TDs. He had another 32 rushing yards and 3,674 yards as well, which, I mean, helped live up to his name. Back in those days, you didn't really get that from a quarterback. That was kind of unprecedented. At least one that, you would expect to throw the football down the field as well. A lot of interceptions. Like you said, he was certainly an interception guy, right? He's going to give you a bunch of good stuff, but there was going to be some bad on the other end of that. But the numbers he was able to put up, he led I think it was almost every single major passing category when he retired, as far as yards, as far as touchdowns, as far as everything. I mean, if you looked at the top of the NFL leaderboards all time, his name was usually there in the number one spot.
Yeah, absolutely. And then his career begins. Norm Van Brocklin was the head coach of the Minnesota Vikings back in those early days as an expansion team. You didn't have a whole lot of talent, and there wasn't that group that the camaraderie wasn't quite there yet. They were working on everything, but they end up winning their very first game that they have, and they're one of the only expansion teams to ever do that. They end up, I believe it was Texas, the Houston Texans in 2003 won their very first game, but they really struggled. They were 3-11 to finish the season, even though they'd won their first game. They only won two more during the rest of that season. So it was kind of rough early beginning, and he would get himself in trouble with his quarterback, Norm Van Brocklin, who had won an NFL championship with the Philadelphia Eagles. He was a quarterback for them back in 1960, decided to take that ride, and while it was hot, he decided to jump on the coaching trail, but he did not like the way that Fran Tarkenton played quarterback. So they kind of struggled a little bit. Fran played his first 4 years in Minnesota. Then he was traded, as you'll see to the left, to the New York Giants. Quite incidentally, New York was not a great team back in those days. They wanted to bring in a quarterback to see if they could bring back some of the glory that they had had in the 50s and 60s, but that didn't happen. 5 years in New York. He was a Pro Bowler for 4 of those 5 years, threw for over 2,000 yards, which again was a lot of yardage back in those days in 4 of those 5 years as well, and just under 2,000 in the fifth. But they weren't quite able to put everything together. Meanwhile, the Vikings had fired Norm Van Brocklin in 67. A guy named Bud Grant comes in, kind of changes the disciplinary manner of the way things are run right there, already has a good core group of guys. They end up going to the Super Bowl back in 1969. They lose to the Kansas City Chiefs, but at least they got there. And then they trade to get Fran back to the team. And he already knew that there was a great nucleus there. And he said, I'm really looking forward to going back to Minnesota because they have a championship team there. A little bit of a knock on New York by saying a championship team there, but not where he was. But he rejoins the Vikings, and that, to me, Brian, is where his legendary status begins. 3 Super Bowls with the Vikings. We'll talk a little bit about the numbers, but certainly Fran Tarkenton was an instrumental portion of that, along with Chuck Foreman, Stu Voigt, Mick Tingelhoff, Ron Yeri, Sammy White, Ahmad Rashad, the guys like that were an integral part and legends of the game because every year they were playing for championships or at least getting to the Super Bowl, getting deep into the playoffs. Things really turned for Minnesota during those 70s years.
Maybe more so for the older guys that follow the sport, but when you think of the Minnesota Vikings, a lot of people, at least probably Minnesota natives, would say the first person that comes to mind is probably the picture on the right, correct? Like Fran Tarkenton sitting on his helmet, wearing the purple and the white. I mean, he kind of exemplifies that team still, because they haven't necessarily had a guy that's kind of taken over the reins and said, hey, I'm the face of Minnesota football. At least not nearly to what Fran did as far as revolutionizing the game, as far as impact on the game, as far as, numbers wise. I mean, he's still probably the main guy as far as the talk of the town. When you say, hey, remember when it comes to Minnesota Vikings football, Fran Tarkenton's face is probably what most people see and probably what most people first want to talk about when they bring up the Vikings.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I've got a couple friends that are Viking fans, and I certainly became one. I loved the white uniforms, and in the
They look
upper
good.
middle of it, just for whatever the purple and the gold, just the way it is. And growing up in Los Angeles, the Rams would play either the Cowboys or the Vikings. It seemed year after year after year in the playoffs during the '70s. And the thing about the Vikings uniforms is the helmet that they have would be a darker color depending on what the light was outside. If they played outdoors, which almost every game was back in those days, and it was cloudy, it almost looked like it was black. The Chicago Bears, for example, it's a navy blue helmet, really dark, but if it's dark outside, it looks like black.
Yeah.
So their colors almost look like black and orange instead of navy blue and orange. And the same thing with the Vikings. It just fascinated me back in those early days, and the color clarity wasn't exactly what it is today. You didn't have 4K technology, but watching playoff games, the absolute cold that Minnesota was, great games that were a part of that history. And Minnesota just bites their teeth and clinches every time they think about how close and how good they were for such a long period of time, but never won a Super Bowl. Let me give you a look at a couple of the numbers before we go on, Brian. 1973, they were 12-2, and they end up going to the Super Bowl. They lose to Miami 24-7, and that was when Miami was in that 2-year reign of just being the team to beat. Nobody had the talent, the speed, the strength that Miami had. Young Don Shula was running that organization, and they were fantastic. 1974, Miami's done, but they have Pittsburgh. Is just at the beginning. The Steel Curtain versus the Purple People Eaters. I still remember watching that game and thinking, man, there's got to be a way for Minnesota to be able to win this, but they just could not move the ball against the Steel Curtain. 16-6 was the final in that one. And in '75, the following year, they're 12-2. They get a home playoff game against the Dallas Cowboys, and wouldn't you know, they lose to the Cowboys on that Hail Mary play. Drew Pearson from Roger Staubach there at the very end of the ball game. 17-14 is the final there. Tarkenton had a fantastic year. He threw for just under 3,000 yards, 6 yards under that, 25 touchdowns, 13 interceptions, and the MVP of the league. But unfortunately, they lose that season. 11-2-1 in 1976. The reward for them there is they get to play the Oakland Raiders. And when they were at their peak, and Oakland had been a second place finisher every year in the AFC. Somehow or another, they'd lose to Miami, they lose to Baltimore, they lose to Pittsburgh. They finally get to the Super Bowl. They win there, and one of the most iconic plays in NFL history is when Tarkenton throws a little out left, quick out route. It's intercepted by Willie Brown. And one of those iconic moments where Willie's face, as he's running apparently right towards the camera in slow motion, it's absolutely fantastic. But the Vikings, again, on the wrong end of history, they lose that Super Bowl 34-14. And you'll see the Raiders, every one of them, Gene Upshaw, John Madden, they're all putting their hand up. We're number one. We're number one. They were the best team in football. 77, they were 9-5. 78, his last year in the league, 8-7-1, 25 touchdowns, 32 interceptions, and they lose in the playoffs to the Rams, and he finally decides to hang it up. But you mentioned some of the numbers, Brian. Absolutely incredible. 18 years as a starting quarterback, only missed a handful of games in his career. But Fran Tarkenton certainly made his name well known in terms of his prowess as a football player and a quarterback for a great team.
Yeah, I mean, I think he did everything right. You know, he showed up, he did his job every single day. I mean, he wanted to win. Obviously, he was a winner, and I think more so than anything, he probably wanted to get done with the Vikings just to be part of there in the beginning and be able to come back and say, okay, we got a chance to do something special, and just kind of be on the wrong end of history every single time. I mean, like you mentioned, every single time they get to the Super Bowl and they have a chance to overcome the hurdle and a chance to do something special, and they just run into a team that's just at their absolute peak, and they're always just kind of on the wrong end of saying, well, maybe next year. It just wasn't our time; it was theirs. But I mean, he was, for how long he played, he was consistent almost the entire time. I mean, really, you didn't have a ton of drop off. I mean, Fran Tarkenton. I mean, there's not a ton you could say about him that's already been said. As far as dual threat quarterbacks, you get guys like Randall Cunningham and Cam Newton, and obviously later on in their career in the NFL's tenure. But what he was able to do kind of laid the groundwork for guys who are saying, hey, I can throw the ball, but I can also make plays with my legs. I can also run around a little bit. He was a bit of a rebel. Obviously, like you said, he butted heads with the coaching staff there in Minnesota, and he kind of did things his own way. And I think it worked out pretty well for him in the end.
Yeah, certainly the numbers speak for themselves. And, he was just part of a legendary time before ESPN. There were only a couple of networks that would show football. I remember on Monday night games when Howard Cosell would announce the halftime highlights. And again, there'd only be two, maybe three games, a possible fourth, depending on how long that they had. And they'd have the fake crowd noise being pumped in while Cosell would say something like Lambeau Field, Green Bay, Wisconsin. The Green Bay Packers take on the Minnesota Vikings. And it looked bleak for Minnesota. But wait. And then he would say what Fran did, and they'd show a picture of him scrambling around, and he'd hit Chuck Foreman at the 10-yard line. He'd get into the end zone. And you really felt, gosh, I want to know more. It created that urgency about football. And you didn't get to see highlights of other teams play back then, but they would always show Minnesota because they were good. One of my trivia questions is, can you name the three teams, Brian, that played for the NFC in the decade of the 70s in the Super Bowl? We're looking at one of them. Do you know who the other two might be?
Man, I would say the Dallas Cowboys
Correct.
potentially be another one. And
Yep.
then is it a team that's still in the NFC?
Yes.
Oh man.
Same division as the Cowboys.
Would it be Washington?
It is Washington.
It is Washington.
So good for
There
you
you
to
go.
know that as quickly as you did. While the ASC had the Colts, the Steelers, the Dolphins, the Broncos, the Raiders, the NFC only had three. And the Dallas Cowboys and the Minnesota Vikings pretty much dominated during that decade. There were 9 of the 10 years of that decade where they were the representative from the NFC. And the only time the Washington Redskins made it was in 72, and they end up losing to the Vikings. Oh, excuse me, they lose to the Dolphins during that undefeated season that they had. But Minnesota was a household name, and a lot of those players that I already mentioned, all on offense, oddly enough, were great players that we got to know because we became familiar with them in November, December, and in January during the playoffs. After his career was over, Brian, I know you wanted to mention a little bit about one of the few players to really make his name known in the business world, Fran Tarkenton being one of those guys. Now, he had his toe in a lot of different pools, but certainly as the 70s were ending, and who would have thought that computer software would be a place to go?
Yeah, I mean, he was, at the forefront of the tech world there for a little bit, which is not necessarily something you'd think of from a guy who's, living in Athens, Georgia, and playing football. But I mean, he did a phenomenal job. He made a ton of money, met a bunch of people. His business became a household name. And if I'm not mistaken, he hosted, well, not hosted, but he was on Monday Night Football as well as a broadcaster. So he kind of got to flip the script a little bit and say, hey, being on the other end of this, being in the booth, being like you were saying earlier, as far as describing the game and making people fall in love with the game, as far as being a viewer at home, sitting on your couch, adding the excitement. He was able to do that and spread the love of football even well after he was done playing.
Yeah, pretty amazing, and one of those guys that took advantage of his name, his branding, and was able to have an excellent career, if you will call it that, as an investor, as a businessman, as a broadcaster, as an author, so many different things. But Minnesota Vikings and New York Giants got to enjoy his talents. He was the most valuable player of the National Football League in 1975. He was a first-team All-Pro in 75, a second-team All-Pro in 1973. He went to the Pro Bowl 9 times during his 18-year career. He led the league in passing in 1978, in touchdowns in 75, and completion percentage in 1977. Some of the accomplishments that he had in terms of just the Minnesota area, he's in the Minnesota Hall of Fame. He's in the Ring of Honor with the Vikings. The 25th anniversary team, which was established in 1985. He is their quarterback of the 40th anniversary team, which was established in 2000. He's a member of that as well. He's one of the 50 greatest Vikings of all time. He's in the College Football and National Football League Hall of Fame. He was the leader in passing attempts, touchdowns, and interceptions when his career ended. His number 10 was retired by the Minnesota Vikings. He's an Orange Bowl champion and a National Football League, an NFC champion, 3 times going over. He is Francis Asbury Tarkenton. Pretty good life for a guy who was the son of a Methodist preacher. So
Yeah.
we congratulate him. Brian, go ahead. Final words.
Final words are, I mean, he's like we're doing. He's a legend of the game. What he was able to do as far as lay the groundwork for what a lot of guys do. I know he's probably not a name that maybe some of the guys that we're seeing at the combine right now would bring up, but what he was able to do, how he's able to revolutionize the sport. And I know that's a cliche that you hear a lot of, but he was one of the true trailblazers that was able to do that. He was able to probably bring a lot of new eyeballs to the game as well, at least in Minnesota, maybe the Midwest as a whole, and what he was able to accomplish on the field. When he left, it was second to none. So you got to tip your cap to Fran Tarkenton. A spectacular year, a spectacular career, and a spectacular life.
Yeah, absolutely. And we wanted to honor him today here on our Legend Show. And again, for Vincent Turner, who's not able to be with us today, Jeremiah Long is our producer and engineer. Brian LeBel is our guest host here today. Want to thank everybody for being a part of the show and learning a little bit more about Francis Asbury Tarkenton and our appreciation for all that he did for college and professional football. We appreciate him well, and we know that you do a little bit more now that you've had a chance to see the show. So I'm Harper LeBel. For all of our cast and characters that are here with 100 Yards of Football, we hope you have a fantastic rest of your day.